The first sign wasn't a text or a lipstick smear. It was a smell, a bright, expensive fragrance clinging to Mark's wool coat the way glitter clings to a party floor. I noticed it the moment he tossed the coat over the banister after a late client dinner, cheerful, and flushed humming a song I didn't recognize. The scent wasn't mine, and it wasn't the soft powder perfume our daughter steals from my dresser on homecoming nights. This was sharper citrus and white flowers, the kind of perfume that announces itself before a woman turns the corner. I told myself it was nothing a stranger's perfume brushed against him in a crowded restaurant. But my fingers lingered on the lapel longer than they needed to. Later, when he fell asleep with the television murmuring, I pressed my face to the fabric and felt my own heartbeat change slow and heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. By morning, the smell had faded, and Mark was all bright plans and coffee. But I had already tasted the quiet dread that lives between one truth and the next. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and tap like and subscribe if stories about loyalty, boundaries, and justice keep you company the way they keep me steady. I want to know whose porch lights are still on while you listen. My name is Elena, and I have spent half my life learning other people's heartbreaks for a living students with trembling hands. In my office, parents who don't know how to say, "I'm sorry." Teachers who bring me their own private worries after school. Yet I somehow convinced myself that knowing pain would protect me from it. I grew up in a house where our word was a promise, and the dishes were done before the evening news, where my mother ironed my father's shirts on Sundays and said, "Faithfulness is a dailiness, not a holiday." When I married Mark at 26, I thought I had chosen a man who understood that rhythm work hard, come home. Tell the truth about the small things so the big things never feel impossible. We built our life in a quiet cul-de-sac outside Columbus, the kind with maple trees that make a tunnel of gold in October, and neighbors who return your trash cans to the curb if the wind takes them. On paper, we were solid, my modest counselor's salary, his bigger commission checks a daughter with a kind heart, and varsity cleats lined up like little soldiers by the back door. We made friends the way couples do in suburbs through booster meetings and charity auctions, and the mutual relief of finding people who laugh at the same stories. Tessa slid into our circle like she'd been there from the beginning, all easy smiles and crisp black dresses, an event planner who could conjure a gala out of a dim gymnasium. She and I shared carafes of coffee over volunteer lists, traded recipes, and sat shoulder to shoulder at school fundraisers, while Mark worked the room charming in that way that makes people remember your name before you've said it twice. I liked Tessa. I liked her competence and the way she never made me feel small for having a sensible wardrobe and a teacher's patience. When she sent a text, "Need a second pair of eyes on an invitation layout," I said, "Of course," and Mark said, "Tell her she couldn't do better than my girl." It felt safe to believe people meant exactly what they said. Travel crept into our marriage the way ivy creeps beautiful before it smothers. Mark's role expanded new territories and quick flights, and I learned the times of day when a hotel lobby echoes and when airport bars turn a man's voice warm and loose. He'd call from San Diego with ocean noise behind him, then from Minneapolis with snow in his laugh, and I would mark the calendars and keep the house on tempo. Lil's college visits penciled between conferences and migraines. When he was home, he made big gestures, surprise dinners, spur-of-the-moment drives for pie, a necklace I didn't need, but wore anyway because he looked so pleased. I told myself marriages lean and stretch and tighten again, that long love is elastic if you treat it kindly, and I folded the laundry by pairs, choosing optimism like a clean towel. There were moments, though, when the room shifted half an inch, a photo tag I couldn't open because the account was private, a charge from a tasting room in a town he swore he never reached because of a weather delay. The faintest glaze in his eyes when Tessa's name came up at a committee meeting, a flash like a bulb behind frosting. I dismissed each one because dismissal is softer than doubt. Because it was easier to smooth the bedspread than to lift it and face what might be living underneath. When Lily asked if Dad would be at her senior night, I promised yes and meant it with my whole chest. When he showed up late with a bouquet and apologies, I told myself bouquets matter. Walter, my father-in-law, watched us with that old carpenter's stare that measures angles most of us ignore. He taught Mark how to hang a door so it wouldn't drift in its frame, and on Sundays he'd sit at our table, hands nicked and healed, telling Lily that a good house starts with a good square. After dinner, when Mark took a call on the deck and the screen door side closed, Walter would stack plates and say, "Everything plum," and I'd laugh and say, "More or less," and maybe that was the first lie I told out loud. On the night I smelled the perfume, Walter hugged me goodbye and said, "You look tired, kiddo," and I said, "Long week at school," and we both pretended that explained the whole of it. I could have told myself forever that marriage is seasons, and this was winter. I could have blamed the airplane hours and the sales targets and the way middle age makes even bright people a little reckless. But the world has a way of setting down clues in plain view, for the moment you're ready to see them, and readiness sometimes arrives without your permission. A week after the coat, while Mark was in Chicago and Lily was at a study session, I carried a stack of clean towels to the hall closet and found tucked behind the board games a small white box from a boutique I know. Tessa favors the tissue still crisp, the ribbon still tied. I stood there for a long time with the towels gathering steam in my arms, listening to the quiet house, and felt something inside me tilt toward the truth I had tried so hard not to name. The white box I found behind the board games stayed in my mind like a splinter. I told myself I would wait until Mark returned from Chicago to ask about it. But the truth was, I didn't have to open it. The boutique logo alone was enough. It was the kind of store where every bracelet cost more than a month of our mortgage, the kind of place I had never stepped into because I always believed we should keep our money in savings for Lily's tuition. My hands trembled as I put the towels away, careful not to disturb the box, as if leaving it untouched would somehow keep my suspicions from becoming real. The next evening, Mark breezed back into the house, carrying takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant. He was all warmth and apologies about the flight delays, setting the cartons on the table, and kissing my cheek like nothing in the world was amiss. I wanted to ask about the gift, but Lily bounded down the stairs with her homework questions, and the moment slipped away. We ate together, laughing at her jokes about her teachers, and for a short while, I convinced myself the perfume on his coat and the box in the closet were disconnected accidents threads that didn't belong to the same cloth. But the unease deepened 2 days later when Tessa arrived at a booster meeting wearing a delicate silver bracelet that caught the light every time she gestured. It was unmistakable. I had seen it in the boutique window during Christmas shopping, admired it briefly, and then walked past. Now it glittered on her wrist, and my throat went dry. She noticed me staring and smiled, tilting her wrist toward me. "Isn't it lovely? A surprise gift. Completely unexpected." The words were light, but her eyes flicked toward me just long enough to sting. That night, when Mark slipped into bed and asked if I was tired, I answered yes, but my body was wide awake, every nerve humming with questions I couldn't voice. I lay there, listening to his steady breathing, and wondered how long he had been giving her pieces of the life he was supposed to be building with me. The next morning, when I folded his shirts fresh from the dryer, I checked each pocket and found nothing, yet the act itself left me hollow. Trust was no longer a given. It had become a scavenger hunt with no prize at the end. The weeks that followed brought more small cracks. Tessa's name began appearing in casual conversation, always wrapped in innocence. "Tessa knows the caterer. She got us a discount," he would say. Or Tessa thought Lily might enjoy the new soccer clinic in town. Each mention felt deliberate, like he was planting her into our daily life, so she belonged without question. Even Lily noticed once, asking, Why does Dad talk about Miss Grant so much? I brushed her off with a quick answer about work and school committees, but my chest tightened. Children sense things adults try to hide. One evening after dinner, Walter dropped by unannounced with a container of chili his neighbor had made. He liked to check in on Lily's college plans and give her advice about scholarships. While she was upstairs printing an essay, he leaned against the counter and studied me. "Everything square, Elena?" he asked, using the phrase he often used about houses and measurements. His eyes lingered on my face like he knew there was more beneath the surface. I forced a smile and said, "Just busy, that's all." He nodded slowly, but the silence between us carried its own weight. The following weekend, Mark claimed he had to attend a regional meeting in Cincinnati. He packed in a hurry, leaving receipts scattered on the dresser. After he left, I collected them, a habit from years of keeping our budget balanced. Mixed in with the gas and toll charges was one from a restaurant known for its candlelit booths and long wine list, the kind of place reserved for anniversaries or proposals. The date matched an evening when he had insisted he was at a networking dinner. I folded the slip of paper and tucked it into my desk drawer, my pulse racing. That Sunday, Lily and I attended church without him. On the way out, I overheard two women whispering about how pretty Tessa looked at the charity gala the night before, standing next to a very distinguished gentleman. I didn't stop walking, but my steps faltered. We hadn't attended the gala. Mark had said the tickets were sold out. The image of him in a suit beside Tessa in one of her black dresses burned in my imagination, and I felt the weight of every lie settling around me. At home, Lily headed upstairs, and I sat alone at the kitchen table with the unopened box from the closet resting in front of me. I had carried it down earlier that day, unable to ignore it any longer. My hands shook as I untied the ribbon and peeled back the crisp tissue. Inside lay another bracelet nearly identical to the one Tessa had worn only in gold instead of silver. There was no receipt, no note, no explanation, just evidence silent and undeniable. When Mark returned late that night, smelling faintly of whiskey, I asked about the box. His eyes flickered before he laughed. "Oh, that, a sample from a client's store. I thought you might like it." He reached for the box casually, but my hand closed over it first. The pause between us stretched thin, and for the first time, I saw a flash of something defensive in his expression. I let go, sliding the box toward him, and said softly, "It's lovely." He smiled, relieved, and kissed my forehead. But when he turned away, the smile on my face slipped into nothing. In the days that followed, I noticed him guarding his phone more closely, carrying it from room to room, instead of leaving it charging in the kitchen. When he stepped outside to take calls, his voice dropped into a tone I had never heard before, softer, almost tender. Once, when I came onto the porch unexpectedly, he ended the call too quickly, offering some excuse about a client who needed an early shipment. I nodded, but inside the steady ground of my life had begun to shift like sand. Even Tessa's presence changed. At meetings, she seemed bolder, laughing more freely at Mark's jokes, brushing his arm as they passed papers. When I caught her eye, she looked away, a faint blush rising in her cheeks. The easy friendship we had built over years dissolved into a brittle politeness that left me exhausted. I went home from one committee meeting and cried in the shower, letting the hot water scald away the tension I could no longer mask. Lily noticed, of course. Teenagers always do. One evening, she asked if Dad and I were fighting, and I told her no, just busy. She accepted the answer, but lingered at the doorway. Her eyes full of questions I couldn't bear to answer. I promised myself I would shield her until I knew the full truth. But promises, made in fear, are fragile things. The turning point came at the end of that month, when I received a call from a friend who had attended another charity event. Her voice was hesitant as she said, "Elena, I don't know if I should tell you this, but I saw Mark last night. He wasn't alone." She didn't say Tessa's name, but she didn't need to. I thanked her, my voice steady, even as my hands went cold. After the call ended, I sat in the darkened living room, listening to the tick of the clock, and realized the first crack had widened into something that could no longer be ignored. And deep down, I knew the next time Mark came home humming with perfume, clinging to his coat, I wouldn't turn away. The call from my friend replayed in my mind long after I set the phone down. I sat in the dim glow of the lamp, staring at the familiar living room walls, yet everything felt foreign, as if I had stepped into someone else's house. The quiet tick of the clock grew louder, with each passing minute punctuating the truth I no longer had the luxury to deny. Mark had crossed a line, and though I had no photographs or receipts in hand, my heart carried the weight of every missing piece. The next morning, I moved carefully through the motions of our life. I brewed coffee, packed Lily's lunch, and kissed her goodbye at the door, as if nothing was wrong. But when she was gone, I lingered in the kitchen with both hands wrapped around my mug, staring out at the yard without really seeing it. Doubt had seeped into every corner of me, and it was heavier than anger. Anger, at least, gives you movement. Doubt pins you in place. That weekend, Mark returned from his meeting carrying flowers and telling stories about road closures and endless presentations. His voice was practiced smooth as always, yet my ears caught every stumble, every detail that felt rehearsed. I nodded, smiled when he expected it, and set the flowers in a vase. But when he wrapped his arms around me, the warmth that used to steady me only left me cold. My body stiffened in ways I hoped he didn't notice, and I pulled back with an excuse about needing to check on dinner. In the nights that followed, I found myself lying awake long after Mark fell asleep. I listened to the steady hum of his breathing, watching the shadows stretch across the ceiling. Sometimes I reached for the quilt my mother had stitched years ago, clutching it tight, as though its threads might anchor me when my own thoughts felt like storm waves. I replayed the bracelet glinting on Tessa's wrist, the receipts tucked in my drawer, and the hesitations in his stories. Each memory stacked on the last until they formed a tower too tall to ignore. Lily's innocence made the weight even harder to bear. One evening, she leaned across the dinner table and asked Mom, "Why do you look sad lately?" Her brown eyes searched mine with a mix of worry and teenage frankness. I forced a smile, assuring her it was just stress from work, but the way she tilted her head told me she wasn't convinced. Children have a way of reading what parents try so hard to hide, and her concern pierced me deeper than Mark's lies ever could. I started noticing little things around the house that I had ignored before. Mark's shirts smelled faintly of cologne even on nights when he claimed to be home late at the office. His phone, once left carelessly on the counter, was now guarded like a fragile secret. He kept it face down, screen locked, and even carried it into the bathroom habits so unlike his old self that they screamed louder than words. I told myself to gather proof, but part of me recoiled at the thought. Proof meant finality, and finality meant dismantling the life we had built brick by brick. Walter came by one afternoon to help repair a squeaky step on the porch. As he knelt with his tools, he glanced up at me, his weathered face serious. "You holding up, Elena?" he asked gently. I nodded too quickly, the answer rehearsed, but my voice caught anyway. He didn't press, just patted the wood beside him and went back to work. Though I felt his silence was its own kind of understanding. When he left, I watched him walk down the driveway, his figure sturdy against the fading light, and wondered how long I could keep the truth hidden from him. At school, even my colleagues began to notice. Pamela, a friend from the counseling office, caught me staring blankly at a stack of forms and asked if I was all right. I told her I was just tired, but when she placed a hand on my arm and gave me a knowing look, I felt the sting of tears rising. I excused myself before she could ask anything more. Carrying the weight of suspicion had become like carrying stones in my chest, visible only to those who cared enough to look closely. I tried distracting myself with routine. I poured my energy into Lily's college applications, staying up late to edit essays and search for scholarships. During those quiet hours, she would sometimes sit with me at the kitchen table, her laughter a balm I desperately needed. Yet, when she finally went to bed and the house grew silent, the questions returned, pressing in from every side. How long had it been going on? How deeply was Tessa entangled in our lives? And why did Mark still come home smiling as if nothing had been lost? The breaking point came one Thursday evening when Mark announced he would be gone again for the weekend. Another regional conference, he said, lightly tossing his tie onto the chair. I nodded, careful not to let my voice shake, as I asked which city. His answer came too fast, too smooth, and when I pressed for details about his hotel, he grew defensive. Why all the questions? Elena, don't you trust me? His words cut, not because they were loud, but because they turned the blame onto me, twisting doubt into accusation. That night, after he fell asleep, I stood at the foot of our bed, staring at the outline of his body under the covers. My heart felt heavy, yet beneath the sorrow was a flicker of something else, resolve. I realized I couldn't go on living in the shadows of half-truths and polite lies. I didn't need every detail spelled out. I had already seen enough. But I also knew silence wasn't strength. Silence was complicity, and I could no longer carry this burden alone. I folded the receipts, tucked them neatly into an envelope, and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. It was a small act, almost ceremonial, but it marked the shift inside me. I would not confront him yet, not until I understood what kind of game I was walking into. But the decision was made. I was no longer just doubting. I was preparing. And as I turned off the lamp and lay down again, the house around me felt different. The walls that once held laughter and routine now carried secrets, and I knew they would not stay quiet for long. The call from my friend replayed in my mind long after I set the phone down. I sat in the dim glow of the lamp, staring at the familiar living room walls. Yet everything felt foreign, as if I had stepped into someone else's house. The quiet tick of the clock grew louder with each passing minute, punctuating the truth I no longer had the luxury to deny. Mark had crossed a line, and though I had no photographs or receipts in hand, my heart carried the weight of every missing piece. The next morning, I moved carefully through the motions of our life. I brewed coffee, packed Lily's lunch, and kissed her goodbye at the door as if nothing was wrong. But when she was gone, I lingered in the kitchen with both hands wrapped around my mug, staring out at the yard without really seeing it. Doubt had seeped into every corner of me, and it was heavier than anger. Anger at least gives you movement. Doubt pins you in place. That weekend, Mark returned from his meeting carrying flowers and telling stories about road closures and endless presentations. His voice was practiced smooth as always, yet my ears caught every stumble, every detail that felt rehearsed. I nodded, smiled when he expected it, and set the flowers in a vase. But when he wrapped his arms around me, the warmth that used to steady me only left me cold. My body stiffened in ways I hoped he didn't notice, and I pulled back with an excuse about needing to check on dinner. In the nights that followed, I found myself lying awake long after Mark fell asleep. I listened to the steady hum of his breathing, watching the shadows stretch across the ceiling. Sometimes I reached for the quilt my mother had stitched years ago, clutching it tight, as though its threads might anchor me when my own thoughts felt like storm waves. I replayed the bracelet glinting on Tessa's wrist, the receipts tucked in my drawer, and the hesitations in his stories. Each memory stacked on the last until they formed a tower too tall to ignore. Lily's innocence made the weight even harder to bear. One evening, she leaned across the dinner table and asked Mom, "Why do you look sad lately?" Her brown eyes searched mine with a mix of worry and teenage frankness. I forced a smile, assuring her it was just stress from work, but the way she tilted her head told me she wasn't convinced. Children have a way of reading what parents try so hard to hide, and her concern pierced me deeper than Mark's lies ever could. I started noticing little things around the house that I had ignored before. Mark's shirts smelled faintly of cologne, even on nights when he claimed to be home late at the office. His phone, once left carelessly on the counter, was now guarded like a fragile secret. He kept it face down, screen locked, and even carried it into the bathroom, habits so unlike his old self that they screamed louder than words. I told myself to gather proof, but part of me recoiled at the thought. Proof meant finality, and finality meant dismantling the life we had built brick by brick. Walter came by one afternoon to help repair a squeaky step on the porch. As he knelt with his tools, he glanced up at me, his weathered face serious. "You holding up Elena?" he asked gently. I nodded too quickly, the answer rehearsed, but my voice caught anyway. He didn't press, just patted the wood beside him and went back to work, though I felt his silence was its own kind of understanding. When he left, I watched him walk down the driveway, his figure sturdy against the fading light, and wondered how long I could keep the truth hidden from him. At school, even my colleagues began to notice. Pamela, a friend from the counseling office, caught me staring blankly at a stack of forms and asked if I was all right. I told her I was just tired, but when she placed a hand on my arm and gave me a knowing look, I felt the sting of tears rising. I excused myself before she could ask anything more. Carrying the weight of suspicion had become like carrying stones in my chest, visible only to those who cared enough to look closely. I tried distracting myself with routine. I poured my energy into Lily's college applications, staying up late to edit essays and search for scholarships. During those quiet hours, she would sometimes sit with me at the kitchen table, her laughter a balm I desperately needed. Yet when she finally went to bed and the house grew silent, the questions returned, pressing in from every side. How long had it been going on? How deeply was Tessa entangled in our lives? And why did Mark still come home, smiling as if nothing had been lost? The breaking point came one Thursday evening when Mark announced he would be gone again for the weekend. "Another regional conference," he said, lightly tossing his tie onto the chair. I nodded, careful not to let my voice shake, as I asked which city. His answer came too fast, too smooth, and when I pressed for details about his hotel, he grew defensive. "Why all the questions, Elena? Don't you trust me?" His words cut, not because they were loud, but because they turned the blame onto me, twisting doubt into accusation. That night, after he fell asleep, I stood at the foot of our bed, staring at the outline of his body under the covers. My heart felt heavy, yet beneath the sorrow was a flicker of something else, resolve. I realized I couldn't go on living in the shadows of half-truths and polite lies. I didn't need every detail spelled out. I had already seen enough. But I also knew silence wasn't strength. Silence was complicity, and I could no longer carry this burden alone. I folded the receipts, tucked them neatly into an envelope, and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. It was a small act, almost ceremonial, but it marked the shift inside me. I would not confront him yet, not until I understood what kind of game I was walking into. But the decision was made. I was no longer just doubting. I was preparing. And as I turned off the lamp and lay down again, the house around me felt different. The walls that once held laughter and routine now carried secrets, and I knew they would not stay quiet for long. The morning after I chose silence over confrontation, something in me shifted. It wasn't peace, not yet, but a clarity that steadied my hands. I could no longer play the role of the trusting wife while evidence of betrayal mounted around me. I realized if I wanted to protect Lily and myself, I had to begin quietly building a wall between his chaos and our lives. That meant planning, not reacting. The first step was practical. I opened a new checking account in my name only at a bank across town where Mark had no ties. I transferred a portion of my salary each pay period, just enough to keep it unnoticed. The teller, a kind woman named Margaret, with silver hair, smiled as she handed me the paperwork. "This will give you some breathing room," she said gently, though I hadn't explained more than I needed an account apart from household expenses. Her tone made me wonder if she had seen women like me before, sitting at her desk with quiet determination and hidden fear. At home, I began collecting records. I pulled statements from the filing cabinet, scanned bills, and copied receipts into folders on a password-protected drive. Every detail mattered: mortgage balances, car loans, utilities, because I knew when the time came, I would need proof of what belonged to whom. I kept the files in a plain manila envelope tucked inside the lining of an old quilt box, certain Mark would never look there. Each page I added was like laying another brick in my wall, separating his choices from my future. I also started paying closer attention to his absences. When he claimed to be traveling for work, I marked the dates in my planner. I tracked how long he stayed away, how often he returned with gifts meant to distract me, and how his explanations never quite lined up. It was subtle work, the kind no one else could see, but it gave me a sense of control. For so long, he had written the story of our marriage with half-truths and diversions. Now, I was writing my own version, one page at a time, grounded in fact instead of fantasy. Walter stopped by one Saturday with Lily's favorite donuts. As she ran off to start her morning, he lingered in the kitchen with his coffee. "You've got that look, Elena," he said quietly, studying me over the rim of his cup. I wanted to tell him everything, but I wasn't ready to risk Mark finding out too soon. So I offered a careful answer. "Just a lot on my mind," I said, setting a plate in front of him. He gave a slow nod, not pressing further, but the kindness in his eyes told me he suspected more than he let on. I began spending more evenings at school under the excuse of catching up on work. In truth, it gave me distance from Mark and space to think clearly. Pamela, my colleague, noticed my longer hours and once brought me a sandwich, saying softly, "Whatever it is, you don't have to go through it alone." Her words stayed with me. Though I still kept my secret close, it reminded me I had support outside the walls of my house, people who would stand by me when the time came. At home, Mark's behavior grew more careless. He left for client dinners dressed sharper than usual, cologne heavy in the air. When he returned, his shirt collars smelled faintly of a perfume I didn't wear. He became quick-tempered over small things, the thermostat setting a misplaced bill. Lily's loud music lashes of frustration that seemed more about guilt than inconvenience. I responded with calm detachment, never raising my voice, never accusing him outright. The quieter I became, the more unsettled he seemed, as though my composure unnerved him more than any fight could have. One evening, while Lily was at a friend's house, I found myself standing at Mark's desk. The top drawer was ajar, and inside lay a receipt for a dinner at the same upscale restaurant where I had once discovered his charge before. 2 meals, 1 bottle of wine, a total far beyond what a simple business dinner would justify. My hands didn't shake as I slid the paper into my envelope. This was not rage, it was record-keeping. Every lie now had a line of proof beside it. Still, I carried my pain in silence. Nights were the hardest. I would lie awake while the house slept, listening to the refrigerator hum and the faint rustle of branches outside. In those hours, the weight of betrayal pressed deepest. Yet I also discovered a quiet strength I hadn't known I possessed. Each tear I shed was private, unaccompanied by accusation or scene. There was power in waiting, in gathering myself before stepping into the storm. Lily noticed the change in me, even if she didn't know the cause. She began sitting closer on the couch during our movie nights, leaning her head against my shoulder, as if to anchor me. Once she whispered, "You're stronger than you think." Mom and my chest ached at her words. I kissed her hair and told her she was the reason I kept moving forward. By early spring, my wall was nearly built. I had my own account records tucked away and a growing file of inconsistencies that painted a picture clearer than any confession from Mark could. I had also begun meeting quietly with James Reed, a discreet lawyer recommended by Pamela's husband. James listened without interruption as I laid out what I had found. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You're smart to prepare before confrontation. This way, you won't be blindsided." His measured tone steadied me. He didn't promise revenge. He promised readiness. I left his office with a folder of advice and a plan to protect myself legally. It wasn't dramatic or loud, but it was mine. Each step I took was deliberate, each decision another layer between Mark's recklessness and the life I wanted for Lily and myself. For the first time in months, I walked through our front door and felt the faintest sense of control return. But control doesn't erase pain. When Mark kissed my cheek that night and asked about my day, I answered calmly, though inside my heart still splintered. It was a strange duality, living one life on the surface while carefully weaving another beneath it. Yet I knew this was only the beginning. Quiet steps are only quiet until they lead you to the place where silence can no longer be enough. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I understood something with a clarity that startled me. I was no longer afraid of discovering the truth. I was afraid of what would happen when I finally revealed it. The weeks of quiet preparation brought me a kind of steady strength, but I knew it couldn't last forever. Secrets weigh heavy, and mine had begun to press against my chest like a stone. Each day I carried the envelope of receipts, the bank statements, and the lawyer's advice in my mind. I had learned to live with the mask of calm, yet beneath it, my patience stretched thin. Something inside me whispered that the time for silence was drawing to an end. The moment came sooner than I expected. One evening, while Lily was at a friend's, I returned from the grocery store to find Mark and Tessa sitting together at my own kitchen table. They had no idea I would be home so early. His jacket was draped over the chair, her scarf tossed on the counter, and the air smelled faintly of her perfume, the same sharp citrus and white flowers I had noticed months ago. Their conversation broke off the instant I stepped through the door. Mark's face drained of color, while Tessa straightened her blouse with a shaky laugh, murmuring something about reviewing plans for a fundraiser. I placed the grocery bag slowly on the counter and looked from one to the other. "I see" was all I said. My voice was calm, almost detached, but the silence that followed was heavier than shouting. Tessa mumbled an excuse about another appointment, and left within minutes, her heels clicking against the tile like hammers. Mark remained seated, staring at the tabletop, as if the pattern in the wood grain held answers. When the door closed behind her, I sat opposite him. "How long?" I asked quietly. He shifted in his chair, rubbed the back of his neck, and began his familiar routine of half-truths. He insisted they were just friends, that I had misread everything, that stress and travel had clouded my judgment. I let him speak until his words twisted into knots. Then, without raising my voice, I slid the manila envelope across the table. Inside lay copies of receipts, bank transfers, and notes from his supposed business trips. He opened it, flipping through page after page, his lips tightening as the evidence mounted. "You went through my things?" he muttered, as though the act of exposure was a greater betrayal than the lies themselves. I leaned forward, meeting his eyes. "I protected myself. You left me no choice." His composure cracked then. He pushed back from the table, pacing the kitchen, throwing accusations into the air about paranoia and lack of trust. But the louder he grew, the calmer I became. For the first time in years, I felt no need to defend myself. I had the truth, and it no longer mattered if he acknowledged it. The conversation ended with his storming out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. I sat in the quiet afterward, hands folded, and realized the mask I had worn was gone. The truth was now out in the open, and nothing could return it to silence. The fallout arrived quickly. Within days, whispers circulated through the school committee that Elena and Mark Brooks were going through something. Tessa avoided me entirely, but I could feel her presence in every sideways glance and hushed conversation. Lily sensed the change most of all. She asked one evening if Dad would still be at her senior banquet. I held her hand and said yes, because regardless of what had shattered between us, she deserved her father present. Still, I knew the event would test every ounce of my restraint. The banquet hall glowed with warm lights, tables covered in white linen and scattered with small floral arrangements. Parents mingled, proud and smiling, while students laughed at the edge of the stage. Mark arrived late, his tie-loosened eyes scanning the room until they found me. He offered a strained smile, one that might have fooled the crowd, but not me. Tessa slipped in shortly after, wearing a shimmering dress that drew every eye. She positioned herself just far enough away to appear innocent, yet close enough to be noticed. I stayed composed, greeting neighbors, congratulating students, and taking photographs of Lily with her friends. But when Mark attempted to sit beside me, I placed my hand firmly on the back of the chair and said softly, "Not tonight." He hesitated, then moved to another table. The message was clear. The show of family unity he had counted on was no longer his to direct. The true breaking point came near the end of the evening. As awards were handed out, Walter rose to speak, offering heartfelt words about the seniors and the importance of building lives on strong foundations. His voice carried the steady weight of experience. As he spoke, I felt his eyes rest on me for just a moment, a silent acknowledgement of truths that no longer needed to be hidden. The applause thundered through the hall, but beneath it, Mark sat rigid, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the table. When the evening ended, I walked Lily to the car, her laughter bubbling over with excitement about the future. Mark lingered by the doorway, waiting as though he expected me to follow. I met his eyes briefly and then turned away, guiding Lily toward the passenger seat. The door clicked shut, and as I started the engine, I felt something inside me settle. The confrontation had not been loud, but it had been decisive. I was no longer the woman who turned away from clues and clung to silence. I had faced the truth and refused to bend beneath it. That night, as I tucked Lily into bed, she whispered, "You were strong tonight, Mom." I kissed her forehead and held her hand until she drifted to sleep. Then I sat alone in the living room, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the house. The storm between Mark and me was far from over, but the balance had shifted. For the first time, he understood that I would not be his cover, his excuse, or his quiet accomplice. And as I looked at the manila envelope on the table, I knew the next steps would no longer be hidden. The world he had built on charm and deception was beginning to crack. And soon the cracks would spread wide enough for everyone to see. The days following the banquet unfolded like the quiet after a storm. On the surface, life carried on. Lily finished her senior projects. I continued my work at the school, but beneath the ordinary, everything between Mark and me had changed. He tried to pretend otherwise, attempting small gestures like bringing home takeout or asking about my day, but there was no rhythm left between us. Each word he spoke sounded like a performance, and I no longer played my part in the scene. One evening, he came into the kitchen while I was grading papers at the table. "We can fix this, Elena," he said, his voice low and strained. I set down my pen and looked at him, really looked at him, the man who had once been my partner and had turned into a stranger. "It isn't about fixing," I answered. "It's about what's already broken." He didn't reply. He stood there for a long moment, shoulders heavy, before retreating upstairs. His footsteps on the stairs sounded like the closing of a door I had already locked in my heart. The community began to notice. At church, people whispered when Mark arrived alone. At committee meetings, Tessa's absence was sudden and sharp. She had resigned from several projects, citing an overloaded schedule, though everyone knew better. Without her presence beside him, Mark looked diminished, his usual charm unable to hold the same sway. The carefully crafted image of stability he had maintained for years was beginning to slip, and with it, the sympathy he once commanded. Walter came to see me on a Sunday afternoon. He sat in his usual chair by the window, his hands folded, eyes searching mine. "I'm sorry for what my son has done," he said quietly. The weight of his words filled the room heavy with sorrow. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. He sighed and added, "A man can build a house straight and strong, but if he lies to the people inside it, the whole thing tilts." His voice cracked slightly, and I knew he was mourning as much as I was, though in a different way. It wasn't long before Mark's unraveling became impossible to ignore. Creditors began calling the house, their polite but insistent voices leaving messages about overdue balances. I discovered he had been dipping into our joint account without telling me, pulling money to cover expenses I hadn't approved. When I confronted him, he lashed out with accusations, claiming I had driven him to it by being cold and untrusting. I didn't argue. Instead, I produced the separate account I had opened months before and told him plainly that my earnings would no longer be used to cover his choices. His face twisted in disbelief, as though the quiet wife he had once controlled had vanished overnight. The next blow came publicly. A neighbor, Mrs. Klein, stopped me at the grocery store and whispered that she had seen Mark and Tessa arguing in the parking lot of a hotel outside town. "It wasn't pretty," she murmured, squeezing my arm. "You deserve better than this." Her words, though kind, stung with humiliation. The scandal had spilled beyond our walls and into the streets where we lived, and I knew there was no reclaiming privacy. That evening, Mark came home late, his tie loose, his expression hard. "You've turned people against me," he snapped, slamming his keys on the counter. I stood at the sink, rinsing dishes, and without turning said, "You did that yourself." The quietness of my tone startled even me. He didn't respond. He stormed upstairs, leaving me with the clatter of his anger fading down the hall. In the days that followed, his desperation showed in new ways. He began posting online vague messages about betrayal and strength, trying to shape a story where he was the victim. Friends who once laughed with him now looked away in discomfort. A few sent me quiet notes of support, acknowledging what they had seen, but hadn't spoken aloud. I didn't reply, but their words gave me strength. The tide was shifting, not through anything I shouted, but through the steady collapse of the lies he had built. Lily's eyes were sharper now. She didn't ask questions, but her silence carried understanding. One evening, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "I've got you, Mom." That simple phrase broke something inside me, releasing tears I had held back for too long. She didn't press. She simply held me until the storm inside passed. By the end of that month, Mark was no longer the confident man who had once filled rooms with his voice. He looked smaller, his suits hanging loose, his shoulders bent. I watched him retreat into himself. His calls unanswered, his charm ineffective. It was as if the world had shifted its gaze, and without its attention, he didn't know how to stand. I realized then that justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it comes quietly in the steady erosion of someone's false front until nothing remains but the truth. Mark had once believed he could shape every story, but the story now unfolding was one he couldn't control. And as I sat in the living room one evening, papers neatly filed and accounts secured, I knew the final piece was near. The reckoning wasn't over yet, but the world he had built on deception was crumbling brick by brick, and soon nothing would be left standing. When the dust finally settled, the silence inside my home felt different. It was no longer heavy with suspicion or grief. It was a clean quiet, the kind that allows you to breathe without waiting for the next blow. Mark's world had collapsed under its own weight, and I hadn't needed to lift more than the truth to make it happen. His lies had chipped away at everyone's trust, until nothing held him up anymore. Walter still came by, but now his visits were gentler, free of questions. He would sit at the table with Lily, telling her stories about building houses when he was young, while I listened with gratitude. His presence reminded me that not all family ties crumble when tested. Even when his son had failed me, Walter had offered steady ground, and I never forgot the kindness in that. Tessa faded from our lives with barely a whisper. Her resignation from committees was final, and soon she moved away altogether. I thought I might feel satisfaction at her absence, but instead, I felt only relief. She was no longer a shadow in my daily life. No longer a presence standing too close to the man I had once loved. Sometimes, justice doesn't come with apologies. It simply comes when the people who caused harm no longer have a place in your story. Lily thrived in the months that followed. She earned her scholarships, accepted an offer from her first-choice college, and walked across the graduation stage with a smile that lit the room. When Mark showed up late and tried to slip into the back row, she kept her eyes on me. Later, when she hugged me tight, she whispered, "We did it, Mom." Those words meant more than any diploma ever could. I stayed in the house, but it no longer felt like the stage for his performance. I repainted the walls, moved furniture, and filled the rooms with my own touches. Each change was small, but together they transformed the space into something new. It was no longer the house of secrets. It was mine. There were still nights when memory pulled at me. The scent of cologne, the sound of footsteps on the porch, the echo of laughter I once thought was genuine. But grief softened, with time turning from sharp edges into worn stones. I learned to let the memories pass without letting them define me. Betrayal had marked a chapter, not the entire book of my life. Looking back, I see now that revenge was never about cruelty. It was about reclaiming my dignity piece by piece, until I stood on solid ground again. I didn't need to destroy him. I only needed to stop letting his choices destroy me. That was the quiet power I found: patience, preparation, and the strength to step away when the truth was finally undeniable. The lesson that stays with me is simple. Trust your instincts even when the world tells you to look away. Protect yourself with calm resolve, and remember that silence can be strength when used with purpose. Most of all, know that walking away from what diminishes you is not weakness. It is the bravest choice of all. Before we close, I'd love to know, have you ever found strength in walking away from something that once defined you? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.